Hello, and welcome to UK Paranormal Files. Here in the UK, we get UFO sightings and alien encounters all the time, and incidents are spread across all parts of the country. But it is fair to say that certain towns and regions have elevated numbers of sightings and have become known as UFO hotspots. One such area is the county of Staffordshire, which is the home to Cannock Chase, which some paranormal investigators and enthusiasts will dub the paranormal capital of the UK. On the 21st of October 1954, Mrs. Jesse Roestenburg, a housewife from Ranton near Stafford, stepped outside of her cottage to find her two children trembling on the floor under a UFO which was hovering just above their cottage. Mrs. Roestenburg's story was reported in the Wolverhampton Express and Star and in the UFO enthusiast newsletter Flying Saucer News for the winter 1954-55 edition. The Roestenburg story must have struck a chord with some people, as many years later, in 1977, the BBC interviewed Mrs. Roestenburg for a TV show called Out of This World. I have decided to share a short clip of that interview with you as a part of this episode, and I do so under the conditions of fair usage.
Staffordshire's had a whole crop of flying saucers. Spots in the sky, lights in the sky, strange things. But the strangest of all was seen one day over this cottage. Mr. and Mrs. Roestenburg were living there, quietly, out in the country. And, well, you just tell me what you saw.
Well, it was one ordinary day. I was waiting for my husband to come home from work, and my two sons went to Seifert to school, and I was getting changed, and I heard this terrific noise. It was just like a giant cauldron of water being poured onto a fire, a shh sort of noise, you know. And my first reaction was, oh, the children. I thought maybe a plane was crashing or something like that. And I slipped my jumper on and went outside to find my two sons lying flat on the ground in the garden in front of the house, shouting, "Mummy, Mummy, there's a flying saucer." Well, naturally, I just said, "Come on, don't be stupid. Come in the house." But felt sort of a strange sensation. Wended my way up the side of the house to where we had a pump, where we used to get all our water from, and automatically looked up to see this, all I can describe, this huge Mexican hat. It was stationary, this thing, and it was bright silver in colour, and it had a dome. It was tilted to sort of, I could see the occupants in it.
You saw people in it?
I saw people in it. There were two people in there. These people were beautiful people. That's the only way I can describe them. They had long golden hair, like a page boy bob, just like the old kings. You used to see photographs of the old kings. And the colour of their hair was golden. Now, I was really...
What were they dressed in?
They had a sort of a polo neck jumper affair, like a ski top suit, in pale blue. Now, these people weren't sat behind, one behind the other. They were sat together, but this, whatever it was tilted so that I could see them and they could see me.
Were you looking at them through windows, through portholes? Or
no, not portholes. It was just sort of like a cockpit, I suppose, that had this perspex or glass or whatever it was. They could see me anyway, and I could see them. And they had beautiful faces. I shall never forget their faces as long as I live. Their foreheads seemed to be a bit larger than, you know, the bottom of their faces as normal people you would expect to see. But maybe this was just whatever they had round their heads, which was like a transparent fishbowl. And they just looked. And I was absolutely paralytic with fear. I couldn't move, although my mind was ticking over. And they looked so sympathetic that I was just mesmerised for what seemed to be, ages, but it could have only been seconds. And I turned to sort of look down at the boys, was unaware that they were with me because I was so absorbed. And the next thing, I looked up and it was gone.
How low had it been?
It had been the height, I couldn't tell you. But the house that you've seen, it was just on top of the roof. It was hovering on top of the roof.
How big was it compared with the size of the house?
It swallowed the whole circumference of the roof. I couldn't see, the roof was completely blotted out. The chimneys I couldn't see. All I could see was this massive object that I described as like a Mexican hat without the bubbles.
And then it flew away sideways or upwards?
No, I didn't see. I just looked up and it had gone. But I assume it went straight up, because for a short while after in the sky I looked around and I said to my two boys, "Where can you see anything? Can you see anything?" And they said, "There it is, Mum," and they pointed up, and I watched it. It was just like a little cotton reel in the sky, and it circled us 3 times. It went round 3 times, and then it just shut off, and that was it. When I started to analyse myself afterwards, I feared that I might have had an hallucination, but then I knew I hadn't had, because my sons were so sure about what they'd seen and what I'd seen. And it went through my mind that it was a secret weapon from Russia, and then I thought, well, it can't be that, because if they had something like that, they wouldn't need to fear anybody or anything.
Were you scared by it? Did you run indoors?
Oh, I was petrified. I couldn't move. I couldn't move a muscle. I was paralysed with fear. But now I wouldn't be. Because now, when I look back, I think, what an amazing thing to have happened, and for me to have seen it.
And when your husband came home, where were you?
Well, when my husband came home from the office, I was locked in the house with my children, under a big kitchen table that we were using.
Under the table?
Under the table, yes. It's funny now when I look back, it sounds absolutely ridiculous, but this is the truth. This happened. And that's it. We were ridiculed. It was very embarrassing at the time, and people, they possibly thought, oh, she's a nutter, but who cares? This is something that happened to me, and I'm a practically minded person, and that's it.
I first saw this interview about a year ago on another YouTube channel, and in researching this episode, have found it has been used on a small number of other YouTube channels already, some dating back over 10 years. Therefore, I feel fair usage covers me for using it too, for the purposes of commentary. However, I am glad that others have been able to use it without falling foul of the BBC's lawyers. The interview stuck with me in my mind for a number of reasons, but mostly because Mrs. Roestenburg's account seemed to me to be sincere. The initial 1954 newspaper report relays Mrs. Roestenburg's account in much the same way as the story is told in the interview, with the key facts the same. Mrs. Roestenburg shared a sketch of what she saw for the newspaper. Gavin Gibbons interviewed Mrs. Roestenburg for Flying Saucer News, and Mrs. Roestenburg then provided additional sketches to aid Mr. Gibbons' report. Mr. Gibbons made repeated visits and became friendly with the family, and he has become one of the chief sources of information about what happened subsequently to the family. It should be noted that commentators on this case do note that Mr. Gibbons was someone who also clearly believed in the existence of UFOs and approached his research as such. This is only noted on the basis that Mr. Gibbons observed the family with this bias. Gibbons was multilingual and spoke Mr. Roestenburg's native tongue, Dutch, and the two became friendly. Gibbons retells a part of the story that was omitted from the initial newspaper report, that on the following Sunday, after the sighting on the 24th of October, the family had a friend visiting them. At some unspecified point through the day, Mr. Roestenburg developed a strange, compelling hunch to check the roof of the cottage for fallen debris from the UFO. He made his way to the roof, where his hunch was proven false, as no debris could be seen. However, having traversed his way up there, he decided to sit for a while and stare at the sky to scan for anything unusual. Suddenly, he gasped for breath, when into view came an enormous cylindrical, sausage-shaped craft in the sky to the southwest. Mr. Roestenburg concluded the craft was not more than a mile away and heading on a curved trajectory. He called out as loud as he could to alert his wife and the guest, and both exited the cottage and witnessed the craft disappear into some distant clouds. Mr. Roestenburg climbed down and excitedly questioned his wife as to if the aircraft they had just seen was the same as the one she had witnessed days before, to which Mrs. Roestenburg indicated it was not, as the craft she had seen was much, much smaller. Their guest offered the observation that he thought he had seen dark spots to the side of the craft that he felt might have been the wings of an aeroplane, but is said to have later withdrawn that idea. We do not know the name of the family friend, or if he was ever independently interviewed, but the Gibbons account relays two important details. Firstly, after this sighting, Mr. Roestenburg became an avid believer and would spend much time in the following months and years scanning the skies in search for another UFO. And secondly, that Gibbons himself concluded that what Mr. Roestenburg had observed was a mothership, whereas Mrs. Roestenburg had observed a scout ship. On the 15th of December, Mr. Roestenburg's avid skywatching seemingly paid off when he had another sighting. This time, he observed a ball of fire in the sky moving at an angle of approximately 45 degrees off the horizon. He raised his arm up in contrast to the object, and the ball appeared about 3 inches against his point of reference. His gaze followed the object through the night sky, and he moved with it, so as to keep it in view, and so moved around to the side of the cottage. After a few moments more, the object appeared so much bigger, and it now seemed closer to 18 inches against his arm. Although it seemed to grow, it seemed also to be moving progressively slower until it almost seemed stationary in the sky. He heard the roar of an aeroplane engine in the distance, and as the noise of the aeroplane grew and seemed to get closer to the fireball object, the fireball suddenly turned to the north in the sky and headed off at an incredible speed, disappearing entirely within a few seconds. The locals found much amusement in the Roestenburgs' accounts, and perhaps not unsurprisingly, they became figures of fun locally. However, they have maintained their story of their sightings and have never recanted on what they had seen. Gibbons wrote about the Roestenburgs in a number of his books, and their story became well known in UFO literature of the time. It was a year later that researcher Wilfred Daniels wrote about the Roestenburgs' account, and it was he who seemingly reported on an additional dimension to the account that prior researchers and journalists either did not learn of or decided to omit from their accounts. It is from Mr. Daniels' account that we learn that in the hours prior to Mrs. Roestenburg's incident that she recounted what she remembered as a queer feeling that something was going to happen to her that day. This was not a specific premonition, but was an emotional sensation of foreboding. The psychic abilities and spiritual nature of the supposed alien beings is in fact the theme of Mr. Daniels' report, whose headline reads, "Flying Saucers and the Psychic," and the opening 2 paragraphs are thus: "Out of all the characteristics ascribed to the extraterrestrials who seem to crew many of the flying saucers that have been seen in close-up over the Earth, there is one in particular of which the vast majority of people, even devout believers in saucers, fight shy. It is the suggestion that there is evidence of gigantic intellect, of spiritual superiority, and the ability to communicate with each other and people on Earth by means of mental telepathy. Most people who are prepared to admit that flying saucers are real, are material and mechanical, and originate from other planets, are yet unable or unwilling to accept the idea that the Saucerians may be, by our standards, almost pure spirit, although possessing flesh and corporeal bodies much like our own. The account goes on to state more directly that Mrs. Roestenburg claimed to Mr. Daniels that she felt she had psychic abilities, but qualified herself not to be a spiritualist. Mrs. Roestenburg had seen spectral manifestations, and her aunt was a practicing psychic healer. A number of years before Mrs. Roestenburg's UFO sightings, she had attended a séance out of a sense of curiosity and was excitedly determined to brave out what she was anticipating to be a spooky experience. As the medium was working through the preliminaries, Mrs. Roestenburg commented about how cold it was in the room, which caused the medium to pause and address Mrs. Roestenburg directly and state, "You are a psychic. You have considerable powers." The Roestenburgs assisted researchers where they could and when asked, but in time other accounts and stories came to the fore, and eventually the Roestenburgs and their account faded into the background. Their account was brought back into the forefront of UFO commentary when, on the suggestion of Gordon Crichton of the Flying Saucer Review, the BBC included Mrs. Roestenburg's account, from which the earlier excerpts were shown. A few years after this, Mrs. Roestenburg reshared her story for Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World, and in 1987 discussed her experiences with Jenny Randalls, who included Mrs. Roestenburg's account within her 1988 book, Abduction. In an interview promoting the publication, Randalls mentions meeting Mrs. Roestenburg and notes, "Jesse Roestenburg impressed me because she had not become a UFO nut and had seemingly read no books on the subject since 1954. She had seen the Spielberg film Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but in typical fashion said about it, 'I remember thinking whoever did this film has a good understanding of the subject. But when those little funny aliens came on, I almost stood up and shouted, "They are not like that!" I do not believe in little green men, not after what I've seen." Another veteran of UFO research, Timothy Good, got in touch with Mrs. Roestenburg a few years subsequent, and in his 1998 publication, Alien Base, he includes his interview with Mrs. Roestenburg, which brings to light some additional details that seemingly had not been included in any of the previous publications or interviews. Mrs. Roestenburg states that soon after her UFO sighting, she felt her health beginning to deteriorate, and goes on to state, "I went to see my doctor who had read about what happened. He thought I was going around the twist. I insisted on going to see a psychiatrist, and he said, 'There is nothing wrong with your mind, but you do need to go to hospital.' He took me himself, and they did a blood count. It was so low they couldn't understand how I was still alive. They said they wouldn't be surprised if I was suffering from radiation sickness. For a while, I was in a terrified mess, but gradually got better." Mrs. Jesse Roestenburg passed away on the 12th of May 2017. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, when I first watched Mrs. Roestenburg's interview about a year ago, it stayed with me as Mrs. Roestenburg struck me as sincere, and it seemed to me to be an account from a member of the general public who had had an awesome experience that had altered her life completely. It was only more recently when I circled back and looked into this more to find out more about this lady and her encounter that I came to realise that a good number of researchers had already been in touch with the family and documented her account in much more detail. Let's summarise the key points of this account. On the 21st of October 1954, Mrs. Roestenburg and her two sons claim to have seen a UFO hovering just above their cottage at Vicarage Farm, Ranton, Staffordshire. It is estimated it was observed in this hovering position for about 15 seconds. She described the vessel as being silver in colour, shaped like a Mexican hat, and it was positioned at a 45-degree tilt in the sky so that the two occupants were visible through a transparent screen. The vessel was estimated to be about 20 feet in length and about 10 feet in height at its highest point. Part of the rim of the vessel appeared to rotate, but the cockpit and part of the outer rim appeared stationary. Mrs. Roestenburg created sketches of the vessel, its occupants, and of the positionings immediately after the event. The vessel was completely silent whilst hovering overhead, although it had been a noise that had initially alerted her and drew her out of the kitchen, quote, like a giant cauldron of water being poured onto a fire. Mrs. Roestenburg's initial thought was that it was the sound of a plane crashing. The occupants were described as human in appearance. Mrs. Roestenburg refers to them as people and not as aliens. They were beautiful with long faces and high foreheads, white skin and long blonde or golden hair down to their necks. They appeared to be wearing some kind of transparent helmets, described as, quote, like a transparent fishbowl, and were dressed in matching turquoise blue tops that Mrs. Roestenburg likened to ski tops. They were sat next to each other, as opposed to one being in front of the other. The occupants of the vessel were unsmiling, but seemed to look sympathetic whilst observing the Roestenburgs. Mrs. Roestenburg and the two children were terrified at the sight of the vessel and the beings. They felt paralytic with fear. After the sighting, they locked the doors to the cottage and hid under the kitchen table until Mr. Roestenburg returned home. A day or two after the initial sighting, Mrs. Roestenburg claimed she no longer felt fear of the beings. When the vessel moved from view, it did so silently and at great speed. It was so quick that Mrs. Roestenburg didn't see the initial motion, but saw it higher in the sky, so knew it had moved straight up to a great height in an instant. It then circled the house 3 times before shooting off out of view at high speed. Mrs. Roestenburg was a housewife and civilian with seemingly no knowledge of the most advanced aircraft in the world of the time. After a period of reflection of the event, she concluded that it was far beyond the technical capabilities of the Russians and stated, for if they had such technology, they would fear no one. In later accounts, we find that Mrs. Roestenburg experienced a detrimental effect on her health, and it is speculated that she may have been exposed to radiation as a part of the experience. It is not clear that this medical assessment was verified independently or if the same ill effects were felt by any of the children, but it was included by Timothy Good in his account, so presumably was assessed and passed through whatever scrutiny he employed in his research. Mr. Daniel's account suggests that Mrs. Roestenburg may have had a form of psychic premonition, and implied that the beings aboard the UFO may also possess psychic capabilities, and that the Roestenburgs, in particular Mrs. Roestenburg, may be people with a greater ability to see or sense these extraterrestrial beings because of that ability. Many reporters and UFO researchers have investigated this case, met with the Roestenburgs and visited the scene. Their story seems to carry sufficient credibility to have endured for nearly 70 years, and has been included very widely in UFO publications, mainstream media reports, and TV shows ever since. Let's deep dive into a couple of talking points, and in doing so, I want to digress ever so slightly. Recently, the US Air Force released videos and details of engagements with what they describe as UAPs, or Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon, In October 2019, Commander David Fravor talked in detail on the Joe Rogan podcast about an encounter he had in observing and chasing a UAP back in November 2004. The footage of this UAP has been released by the Pentagon and is in the public domain in the US. Commander Fravor was leading an air defense training exercise 60 miles off the western coast of the US and Mexico. The training team and pilots were unaware that for 2 weeks prior to this exercise, the USS Nimitz had been tracking on military radar about a dozen incursions by an unidentified craft into the vicinity, whereby the craft would seemingly drop from above 80,000 feet and be tracked descending at phenomenal speed to about 20,000 feet, where the vessel would sit for a short time before then disappearing by ascending out of the atmosphere at a speed too quick to monitor by radar. Usually these incursions would occur whilst no military or civilian aircraft were in the air, and for a multitude of reasons, it seems the military's leadership was content not to engage aircraft to pursue and observe. On November 14th, however, midway through Commander Fravor's exercise, another of these UAPs appeared about 60 miles to the west of the aircraft's then current position. So the order was given to break from training and to engage. It should be noted that the Air Force jets had no live missiles and were carrying training loads. I would imagine most people viewing my video will have already seen Commander Fravor's Joe Rogan episode, but if you haven't, please go and watch it after this video, as it is a fascinating incident, and Commander Fravor goes into great detail about what he saw and how the technology available to them tracked the object. I think once you've seen it, you will agree that Commander Fravor is a very credible individual whose account cannot be dismissed lightly. Anyway, in Commander Fravor's account, we learned that not only was footage of the craft captured, but that this vessel was observed both visually by the pilots and additionally by FLIR, TV and radar, ascending and descending tens of thousands of feet in a matter of a second or two. Additionally, when Commander Fravor attempted to get close to the vessel, they observed it was interacting with a second submerged vessel in the water. When they got close to it, the UAP started to move in circles in an initial attempt to outmaneuver the incoming US planes. Soon after this, it ascended up into the upper atmosphere at a great speed and out of sight. In respect to Mrs. Roestenburg's sighting, she described that the UFO circled her house 3 times before ascending off in the sky at a great speed. When contrasted to Commander Fravor's account, we now have to note that this description from the housewife from Ranton must be rendered feasible and entirely consistent with the observed behaviour of the UAP seen by the very experienced pilot Commander Fravor. In a second set of released footage, dubbed the gimbal footage, we observe a UAP which is seemingly rotating on its own axis whilst in mid-flight. It was speculated by Bob Lazar that these vessels and their propulsion and aerodynamic systems might do this by necessity of design. It is interesting then to return to Mrs. Roestenburg and her 1954 sighting. In her account, the vessel was hovering and was angled at approximately 45 degrees so that the cockpit's inhabitants could observe the fearful family. When hearing the initial account, you get the sense that perhaps the craft's pilots angled the ship as a matter of necessity to observe the family, and you would then be forgiven in reflection for wondering or assuming that this was an uncomfortable manoeuvre for the purpose of observing the family. After all, if we were on a fair ride or in a helicopter and we were suspended at a similar angle, our gravity might make this difficult, or at least potentially awkward, as a position to hold. But when we see the gimbal footage and consider just how technologically advanced these vessels must be, it really might have been the simplest of things for this ship to manoeuvre into this position, shape and angle. The point here would be that, in any reasoned and potentially sceptical review of Mrs. Roestenburg's account, it should be noted that the craft's capabilities are consistent with the recorded behaviour of the US military's UAP footage. As for the beings themselves, it seems that Mrs. Roestenburg has relayed descriptions typical of what many people call the Nordic aliens. In keeping with other sightings of the beings themselves, they appear almost human, but with slightly differing facial characteristics, oftentimes described as beautiful to human eyes. It is in Mr. Daniels' retelling of the account, which we have touched upon already, that an element of psychic interaction and foreboding is indicated. This is not unique to this case insofar as UFO encounters go, and is certainly consistent with encounters with the Nordic aliens. There are many people who have claimed to have had close encounters and relayed that they felt that communication was achieved by psychic means, as if speaking mind to mind. Mrs. Roestenburg does not relay this specifically, but her account does include that notion of foreboding, that she had a sense that something was going to happen to her that day, but she also relayed that she felt some sense of sympathy from the beings, though it's not clear if this was from their facial expressions or if it was psychically gleaned. Furthermore, Mr. Roestenburg had had that intuition of his own, whereby he left his wife and house guest and went up to the roof of the house, whereby he then saw a different vessel. Does it strike anyone else as an odd thing to do? If he had not followed that intuition, the three of them may never have then seen that second craft. In any case, psychic intuition or communication is not original to this specific account. It is, however, a topic that, when introduced to a case file, does lead some to question the validity of the encounter altogether. There does seem to be a section of people out there who have claimed to have had remote spiritual and or psychic connections with alien races. And when you look back over accounts over many decades of the supposed links to beings on Venus, Mars, and even the Pleiadians, and of the supposed messages being received, it is easy to see why just the mentioning of psychic abilities or remote interactions in relation to UFO sightings or alien encounters might be a trigger to take that person's account with heart-stopping pinches of salt. I did wonder, whilst pulling this episode together, if any of you watching this might have experienced a shift in opinion whilst watching the episode, going from the earlier part of the episode and believing Mrs. Roestenburg's account, and then changing opinion when learning of Mr. Daniels' weighted offering. This is the third video on this channel that seems to recount interactions with the so-called Nordic aliens, and there is a 100% record of coincidental and subsequent psychic activity to a greater or lesser extent, and that seems to have affected the witnesses both during their encounter and then subsequent to those events in their personal lives. Although conflation with mysticism and spiritualism seems to muddy the waters for many, it is, to my mind, becoming a discussion point which is intertwined with numerous encounters and not something I am ready to dismiss. I should acknowledge there is clearly a difference, even in hypothetical speculation, between examining the concept of psychic contact, which may or may not eventually be observable and measurable to scientific disciplines, and the contemplation of alien beings demonstrating some form of spiritual qualities and or interdimensional existential presence or travel capabilities. When we contemplate the complicated subject of theoretical physics, one of the chief hypotheses is that of superstring theory, which requires an understanding of the universe existing in 9, 10, 11, or maybe as many as 26 dimensions. And it is hypothesized that some of these unseen dimensions are folded in to the dimensions that are observable to humans. Some theologists have already suggested that these concepts of folded in dimensions are consistent with Scripture and will eventually be key to our understanding of the difference between the physical and spiritual worlds. It seems to me that some psychic interaction goes hand in hand with many alien encounters. That is not to say that all UFOs are seen psychically and are immaterial, nor is it to say that all alien encounters always involve some level of psychic interaction. Already on this channel, we have examined cases which exhibited both. I will link in the description below to the 2 other videos on this channel which examined encounters with Nordic aliens. I think you will find them interesting, especially when contrasted to the Roestenburg's experiences. The Roestenburgs seem to have had a vivid and very well documented set of encounters, with the initial sighting being particularly striking. I have set out the facts and shown a clip so that you could hear Mrs. Roestenburg's account in her own words. Over the course of nearly 7 decades, and with much examination, many journalists and researchers have relayed the Roestenburg stories, and the central facts have remained consistent over time. When I look back myself over the details of this case and try to formulate a conclusion, the first and inescapable point that comes to mind is that there is no physical evidence to back up the sightings. It is therefore a case whereby we are reliant upon the testimony of the key witnesses. Mrs. Roestenburg's account, when heard in her own words, does seem credible to me. But it is impossible to say with 100% certainty, however, that the events have been recorded and happened as relayed by Mr. and Mrs. Roestenburg. There are little bits that catch the ears when the account is listened to over and over again, that cast just a little bit of doubt in the mind. It is also notable how some information seemingly only came to hand when revealed later by a different journalist or researcher, possibly indicating embellishments were being added later. However, when it comes down to it, there are only 3 possibilities. Either they are telling the truth, they are lying, or in a very unlikely third scenario, multiple events and actions came about which led to a series of misidentifications. When then judging between these 3 options, I personally find myself leaning towards the first. When I consider how many journalists and UFO researchers have covered this case over many decades, that would have looked into local flight patterns, that would have probed the family time and time again about specific details, it seems the account has held up over time. More than that, in fact, as we discussed previously, the craft itself was described as moving in a way consistent with the US military's declassified UAP footage. I asked myself, how likely is it that a housewife from the 1950s would be able to describe a UFO with the same capabilities and in the same terms as an experienced military pilot in 2019? If it was a lie, the Roestenburgs have done a very good job in keeping up the act for all this time. Although I do try to be balanced in my presentation of information, by now regular viewers of my videos may be detecting some of my own biases, real or perceived, and that's entirely normal. I'm not a journalist, and any semblance of reputation in this space is not predicated on my impartiality. I think in this case, the facts as laid out will not leave many viewers to this point in the video in a position of being undecided. However, I doubt it will have changed many people's minds either. Those with hard skeptical opinions on UFOs and alien sightings probably won't have watched the video all the way through. But even if they did, it's unlikely a shift of opinion has occurred. As I said at the start of this summary, this case centres around a set of compelling eyewitness accounts, which is deemed insufficient to many, as the testimony of the general public is generally considered insufficient to sway the sciences. Either way, hopefully one thing I have achieved for at least some of you is to have brought forth another case worthy of contemplation and further exploration that some of you may have not been previously aware of. As always, I will link to sources and further reading in the description section below, so please feel free to explore this case further. If you have enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up button to let me and YouTube know that you enjoyed it. Please also leave me a comment down below and let me know what you think of the Roestenburg sightings. Let me know too, what did you make of Mrs. Roestenburg's interview? Did you detect anything that might suggest that this was all just a tall tale? And if you would like to support this channel, the best thing you can do is give this video a share on social media and share it with your friends and family. There are buttons just below the video that can help to make this easy. If you're old school, however, feel free to copy and paste the link and send it on email to someone you know who might enjoy it. If you have not done so already, please also click the subscribe button to follow the channel. And don't forget to enable notifications so that YouTube will alert you the next time a regularly scheduled episode goes up. As always, all that's left for me to say is, thanks very much for watching.